Let me take a moment before this episode to tell you a little bit about the World Ethics Organization and the upcoming Global Ethics Day. Premiering online Wednesday, October 18th at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the Ethics and Leadership Global Ethics Day Symposium hosted by the World Ethics Organization. This live-stream virtual symposium will cover topics such as what it means to be an ethical leader, why ethical leadership is beneficial to you, your team, your company, and the world, how to integrate ethical considerations into your decision-making process, and practical steps that you can take to create and maintain a culture of ethics. The event panelists are among the world's foremost leaders and influencers in the field of ethics, including Dr. Simon Longstaff, AO, Executive Director of the Ethics Center, Sydney, Australia, and Skeet, Senior Director of Leadership Ethics at the Markula Center for Applied Ethics, Santa Clara University, and Dr. Walter Fluker, Martin Luther King Jr. Professor Emeritus of Ethical Leadership, Boston University. Register and join this live event October 18th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time at worldethicsorganization.org/upcoming events. And thanks. Hello, my name is Hasan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 79, with, as usual, our regular co-host today, Tom Libby. Hello, Tom.
How you doing, Hasan? Thanks for having me.
All right. And with our book today, opening our month, looking at works written by authors who stared into the abyss of warfare, chaos, and the outcomes that inevitably warfare and chaos bring on civilizations and peoples, including the nomads of the Arabian Desert, the native tribes of the Americas, and of course, this all the way to the steppes of the Russian plains. We close out the second season. We're turning the corner here on the second season of this podcast, rounding the corner towards episode 100, by beginning our month with the book that documents in stark, harsh, and relentlessly unforgiving detail the conflicts that underlie or that created the spread of the people of European descent into the American West. D. Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, an Indian history of the American West. And I open today with chapter 1. Their manners are decorous and praiseworthy. Where today are the Pequot? Where are the Narragansett, the Mohican, the Pokanoket, and many other once powerful tribes of our people? They have vanished before the avarice and the oppression of the white men, as snow before a summer sun. Will we let ourselves be destroyed in our own turn without a struggle, give up our homes, our country bequeathed to us by the Great Spirit, the graves of our dead, and everything that is dear and sacred to us? I know you will cry with me, never, never. Tecumseh of the Shawnees. It began with Christopher Columbus, who gave the people the name Indios. Those Europeans, the white men, spoke in different dialects, and some pronounced the word Indian or Indiana or Indian. Peau Rouge or Redskins came later. As was the custom of the people when receiving strangers, the Taínos on the island of San Salvador generously presented Columbus and his men with gifts and treated them with honor. So tractable, so peaceable are these people, Columbus wrote to the king and queen of Spain, that I swear to your majesties there is not in the world a better nation. They love their neighbors as themselves, and their discourse is ever sweet and gentle, and accompanied with a smile. And though it is true that they are naked, yet their manners are decorous and praiseworthy. All this, of course, was taken as a sign of weakness. If of Pokanoket, he devoted most of his time to forming, I skipped. If not heathenism, sorry, my apologies. All this, of course, was taken as a sign of weakness, if not heathenism. And Columbus, being a righteous European, was convinced the people should be, quote unquote, made to work, so, and do all that is necessary to adopt our ways, close quote. Over the next 4 centuries, 1492 to 1890, several million Europeans and their descendants undertook to enforce their ways upon the people of the New World. Columbus kidnapped 10 of his friendly Taino hosts and carried them off to Spain, where they could be introduced to the white man's ways. One of them died soon after arriving there, but not before he was baptized a Christian. The Spaniards were so pleased that they had made it possible for the first Indian to enter heaven that they hastened to spread the good news throughout the West Indies. The Tainos and other Arawak people did not resist conversion to the Europeans' religion, but they did resist strongly when hordes of these bearded strangers began scouring their islands in search of gold and precious stones. The Spaniards looted and burned villages. They kidnapped hundreds of men, women, and children and shipped them to Europe to be sold as slaves. Arawak resistance brought on the use of guns and sabers, and whole tribes were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people in less than a decade after Columbus set foot on the beach of San Salvador, October 12, 1492. Communications between the tribes of the New World were slow, and news of the Europeans' barbarities rarely overtook the rapid spread of new conquests and settlements. Long before the English-speaking white men arrived in Virginia in 1607, however, the Powhatans had heard rumors about the civilizing techniques of the Spaniards. The Englishmen used subtler methods. To ensure peace long enough to establish a settlement at Jamestown, they put a golden crown upon the head of, and I'm going to butcher these Indian names today. Pardon me. I am going to butcher them. My apologies to Tom and to everybody else. This is going to be terrible. This is going to be the first one. So they put a golden crown upon the head of Wahun Sonakuk, dubbed him King Powhatan, and convinced him that he should put his people to work supplying the white settlers with food. Wahun Sonakuk vacillated between loyalty to his rebellious subjects and to the English, but after John Rolfe married his daughter Pocahontas, he apparently decided that he was more English than Indian. After Sonakuk died, the Powhatans rose up in revenge to drive the Englishmen back into the sea from which they had come, but the Indians underestimated the power of English weapons. In a short time, the 8,000 Powhatans were reduced to less than 1,000. In Massachusetts, the story began somewhat differently, but ended virtually the same as in Virginia. After the Englishmen landed at Plymouth in 1620, most of them probably would have starved to death but for the aid received from friendly natives of the New World. A Pemaquid named Samoset and 3 Wampanoags named Massasoit, Squanto, and Hobomah became self-appointed missionaries to the Pilgrims. All spoke some English, learned from explorers who had touched ashore in previous years. Squanto had been kidnapped by an English seaman who sold him into slavery in Spain, but he escaped through the aid of another Englishman and finally managed to return home. He and other Indians regarded the Plymouth colonists as helpless children. They shared corn with them from the tribal stores, showed them where and how to catch a fish, and got them through the first winter. When spring came, they gave the white men some seed corn and showed them how to plant and cultivate it. For several years, these Englishmen and their Indian neighbors lived in peace, but many more shiploads of white people continued coming ashore. The ring of axes and crash of falling trees echoed up and down the coast of the land, which the white man now called New England. Settlements began crowding in upon each other. In 1625, some of the colonists asked Samoset to give them 12,000 additional acres of Pemaquid land. Samoset knew that land came from the Great Spirit, was as endless as the sky, and belonged to no man. To humor these strangers in their strange ways, however, he went through a ceremony of transferring the land and made his mark on a paper for them. It was the first deed of Indian land to English colonists. Most of the other settlers coming in by thousands now did not bother to go through such a ceremony. By the time the Massasoit, great chief of the Wampanoags, died in 1662, his people were being pushed back into the wilderness. His son, MetaCom, foresaw doom for all Indians unless they united to resist the invaders. Although the New Englanders flattered MetaCom by crowning him King Philip of Pokanoket, he devoted most of his time to forming alliances with the Narragansetts and the other tribes in the region. In 1675, after a series of arrogant actions by the colonists, King Philip led his Indian Confederacy into a war meant to save the tribes from extinction. The Indians attacked 52 settlements, completely destroying 12 of them, but after months of fighting, the firepower of the colonists virtually exterminated the Wampanoags and the Narragansetts. King Philip was killed and his head publicly exhibited at Plymouth for 20 years. Along with other captured Indian women and children, his wife and young son were sold into slavery in the West Indies. When the Dutch came to Manhattan Island, Peter Minuit purchased it for 60 guilders and fish hooks and glass beads, but encouraged the Indians to remain and continued exchanging their valuable peltries for such trinkets. In 1641, Willem Kieft levied tribute upon the Mahicans and sent soldiers to Staten Island to punish the Raritans for offenses which had been committed not by them but by white settlers. The Raritans resisted arrest, and the soldiers killed 4 of them. When the Indians retaliated by killing 4 Dutchmen, Kieft ordered the massacre of 2 entire villages while the inhabitants slept. The Dutch soldiers ran their bayonets through men, women, and children, hacked their bodies to pieces, and then leveled the villages with fire. For 2 more centuries, these events were repeated again and again as the European colonists moved inland through the passes of the Alleghenies and down the westward flowing rivers to the Great Waters, the Mississippi, and then up to the Great Muddy, the Missouri. The 5 nations of the Iroquois, mightiest and most advanced of all the eastern tribes, strove in vain for peace. After years of bloodshed to save their political independence, they finally went down to defeat. Some escaped to Canada, some fled westward, some lived out their lives in reservation confinement. During the 1760s, Pontiac of the Ottawas united tribes in the Great Lakes country in hopes of driving the British back across the Alleghenies, but he failed. His major error was an alliance with French-speaking white men who withdrew their aid from the Peaux Rouges during the crucial siege of Detroit. A generation later, Tecumseh of the Shawnees formed a great confederacy of Midwestern and Southern tribes to protect their lands from invasion. The dream ended with Tecumseh's death in battle during the War of 1812. D. Brown's book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, stands alongside The Rape of Nanking, Man's Search for Meaning, The Gulag Archipelago, and 4 Hours in My Lai as a primer on warfare and the psychology of genocidal destruction that warfare and violence engenders. The idea, not the lived reality, of the New World in the European mind is really the crux of the problem here. And this idea that the Europeans had when they came to the quote-unquote New World, because it was new to them, was that the mighty geography of such a place that they had never yet explored would somehow trump puny human behavior. This was a European phenomenon of magical thinking that took up until the 20th century, and some would say it still has not taken yet, but that it would take up until the 20th century to really go on life support. Now, the Native American tribal peoples of the Western Hemisphere placed emphasis on the binding of people to the land via nature, and the Europeans of Western Europe placed emphasis on possession and ownership of the land via contract and law. And the chaos generated from this clash of values, worldviews, and behaviors played out its penultimate third act in the western part of the North American continent after the United States' Great Civil War. And we're going to talk about a lot of this today with Tom here on the podcast. And Tom's very passionate about this book because of his background and his culture. He knows this book very, very well, way better than I know it, and knows the underlying history of the book. He's actually taught this book at Harvard and lectured on it and advocated for Native American and Indian rights in America. And as we saw back in our episode on Black Indian slave narratives, Tom has a deep understanding of all of this in ways that I just don't have. Now, I want to say this up front, and I'm going to address it again a little bit later, but I don't believe in oppression Olympics. So Tom and I kind of talked a little bit about this offline. Clearly, if you're watching this on video, you can see the level of melanin in my skin. You can see the level of melanin in Tom's skin. And one of the interesting things about the New World, that whole geography trumping human behavior thing, is that many, many, many people have come to the United States in order to walk out a great experiment. And that great experiment is this: can a bunch of people who don't look alike actually manage to live together without engaging in utter genocidal destruction of each other? And that is a massive challenge that we have to place in an appropriate historical and anthropological context. And this book goes a long way to answering that question in ways that are very, very uncomfortable, but not, I want to be very, very clear, ideological, because these are human problems, not problems of ideology. So let's start off with that, Tom. Talk with us a little bit about this book, about your history with the book, D. Brown's work. Kind of download us everything you know, or at least a lot of what you know, so that we can get started here today. Because there are lessons for leaders in this book, which we are going to also explore as well. So talk with us a little bit about Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee.
Before I do that, let me just say something real quick.
Yeah.
Nina miga mawaj akdelawisi kipua pita takan, which essentially in my language says, my name, which, by the way, so my native name is Eagle Rising. So it says my name is Eagle Rising, and I am of Mi'kmaq descent. Figured I'd at least start with that, so people have an essence of knowing that this is not just like, oh, I just really like this book, right?
Right.
And I know you did a pretty good job of kind of prepping that, but I think there's a level that goes beyond when you can actually say something in the language that people can understand. So, okay, so back to your question now then. So I, like everybody else, went through U.S. history, right? So we read all the history books. We've heard about Manifest Destiny and Westward Expansion. We heard about the Pilgrims and the Plymouth Rock and all that other stuff. D. Brown's book to me was extraordinarily eye-opening. If you think about this, for the most part, no matter what you read in a history book, when it's provided by the school system, and I don't care what school system you're talking about, whether it's Massachusetts or California, Texas, it doesn't matter. It's limited in its capability and capacity to tell you the magnitude of the problem. And I'm not even going to go down the path like you had meant the oppression Olympics. That's not, I'm not saying it for that reason. I'm saying it for all of the reasons, because even when you study the segments of U.S. history, like the colonialism and the beginning stages of the European entering the country versus the Civil War and World War II. I mean, think about World War II and how massive of a scale that was, yet our U.S. history books cover it in one chapter, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm only saying it for that purpose, so that when I started reading D. Brown's book, it really was an eye-opening experience to me as the magnitude of what really happened. And I guess kind of started the process for me of really trying to evaluate and judge the way in which our government works, not what happened 200 years ago, just the mechanisms in which we now have that should have been in place back then if all things are considered the same, right? Like, so the way that we had a conversation in one of these episodes about the Constitution itself, mm-hmm. and we had a really good conversation about it, and how that Constitution is malleable. It was really shocking to me to see the difference on how that Constitution was implemented and leveraged in the mid 1800s versus today, right? Yeah. So again, it has nothing to do with oppression Olympics. It has way more to do with the progression and the malleability of our cultures and the clash of those cultures, right? So for me, D. Brown's book was the first of a series of books that I started to read to really start trying to understand trials and tribulations of our ancestors, my ancestors, that I can only leverage stories being told by family members that are now being given to me in book form from either journalists or anthropologists or people that are supposed to have a very subjective standpoint, and they don't have an agenda, right? D. Brown didn't really have an agenda when he wrote this book. He wrote subsequent books that did have certain agendas. So I'm not gonna free him from that, because I think most people have a tendency to have these agendas when they write, especially multiple books. Mm-hmm. I don't think he had one in the first book, other than I really just want to show what really happened because people don't know. And it it did impact me quite a bit. It really made me feel comfortable and confident to go digging more. So hopefully that answers your question. I think it does anyway.
One of the things that really struck me about this book is I've also read A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn.
Mm-hmm.
And Howard Zinn and I get off the train with each other for a whole variety of reasons. But the biggest one is I liked what you said there about D. Brown in his first book, approaching this topic without an agenda. Everything I've ever read by Howard Zinn has an agenda attached to it. And it is the agenda I reject. If he were merely approaching A People's History of the United States from the perspective of merely writing objectively about things that have been underreported in history in America, okay, I can get on board with that. But there's definitely an ideology attached. And I think that that's where you get into, you open the door to not just another person's story being told, but you open up the door then to the interpretations of that story. And as I've said before on this podcast, and I'll say again, it is one of the anthems of my life. We're all perfect in 2023 or 1999 or 1970, whatever, in comparison to whoever was that came before us. We're always perfect. Except the problem is, someone else is coming down the pike in 2050 or 2173 or I don't know, 2980. Someone's going to come that's going to think we're less than perfect and is going to judge us harshly. And I would rather see a lot of humility from people. And that's kind of what I got in D. Brown's book. I got the sense that he wasn't, like you said, he wasn't approaching it with an ideological or even an agenda-driven axe. He was approaching the topic with a sense of humility.
Yeah. And that definitely and sort in a sort of in a matter of factness, right? Like right. there was much more like a, you know, and he wasn't opinionated about much in the book. It was very right. much like, I researched this, I found this, here it is. I researched this, and it wasn't like, because even today, some people will write it and they'll go, I researched this. And then as they write it, they lean it, right? Yep. Like, hopefully people understand when I'm talking about this, but like, and I see journalists do it all the time. And journalists like, I want to pull my hair out because, you know, when we grew up with people like Walter Cronkite and people that just reported the news, just, you know, Dragnet, right? Just the facts, man. Like, you know, a lot of journalists don't do that anymore. A lot of journalists will try to pull things in the direction that they want people to see them in. And I really felt like D. Brown did a nice job, kind of just the facts, ma'am, right? Like he just went and found it, reported, and said it the way he saw it, gave it to us in the style and the rhythm that he found it in. He didn't try to change a lot of the narrative based on his interpretation of what was happening, right? And there's, if you've never read the book, and I don't know if you've read it cover to cover yet, but there's a particular one in there about a group in the western part of our country, the leader there, Black Kettle. There was a component there. Do you remember him talking about, oh, we're safe because he hoisted the American flag up in front of his village, thinking that because he had an agreement, him hoisting this flag up, everything would be fine. And then the U.S. cavalry just annihilated the whole village.
Yep.
So he didn't sugarcoat that. He didn't lean that. He literally, he gave you that story as it was told by the people that were there, right? So again, like, so I'm just saying, like, I think he did a nice job. Now, again, subsequent, I've read some other stuff from him. As I read it, I was like, oh, I'm not reading this anymore. Like it just felt like it was leaning. Yeah. I don't need that. I don't need somebody to be offended for me. I don't need some, like, I was like, I don't want to read that. Like, I'm good.
Well, and that's the other thing is like, so you get into with books like this, or I mentioned The Rape of Nanking by Iris Chang, which eventually I will go back into that. It's been years since I read that book, but I'll go back into that at some point in time on the podcast here, because it does sit alongside books like The Gulag Archipelago, or the stories of the American involvement in My Lai during the Vietnam War as one of those black eyes, maybe, is being generous, not just on America but on humanity in general.
Yeah.
I am not going to use the word genocide because actually I think that word is now in our particular cultural moment overused. And so words have meanings, right? And they should be used very sparingly. It's like we use the word Nazi, in our political discourse now, and I find that to be distasteful as well. Or fascist. That's the big one. Like, we're using that now. I found the language that the book was written in to be very interesting because, as a person who does sort of read books for language, and does know that language has meaning, it was interesting to me to watch the language shift as we went through the book. Particularly, I think one of the particular first turns was around the battles of Sand Creek and Powder River, which I'm very familiar with, having spent 10 years in Minnesota. Very familiar with the outcomes of both of those wars. The thing about language is that it also gets you into everything. And so there was one of the things that really jumped out to me in the book was it seemed as though the Native American tribal leaders and the US government were both talking past each other, even when they were in the same area, allegedly talking to each other. Now, we're going to break this down a little bit more, but talk a little bit about that, because there did not seem to actually, it's like they were talking on different planets. It's like if we're talking to people on Jupiter, and the people on Jupiter, if there are people on Jupiter, trying to talk to us, it's almost as if it was unintelligible. And I didn't get it. That was one of the big things that jumped out to me. I did not understand that.
So I'm pretty sure I've said this on this podcast more than once, but I'll say it again. You've heard the terms like the more things change, the more things stay the same, right?
Right.
Like,
yeah.
This is still happening. This is not like something that happened in the 1800s and we left it, right? Standing Rock was a good example of that, right? Mm-hmm. Standing Rock just recently, just a few years ago, we had this big clash of and sometimes it's just terminology, right? Like, so sometimes it's like what you consider sacred, or the word that you consider sacred, is different than your neighbor, mm-hmm. right? Like you could be looking at, like, your television is sacred because you love it and you watch it all the time, as opposed to having like a spiritual meaning behind it. So there's some differences there. But and to what you're talking about, here's the part that nobody likes to, not that nobody likes to talk about it, but it seems to get overlooked and skipped an awful lot. The tribal leaders and the government were not necessarily talking to each other directly. There were a lot of interpreters. And what we don't know, because we weren't there, is how impactful the interpreters were in the interpretation and how purposeful they were in the interpretations. Was it greed on their part? Did they have something to gain if one thing fell apart versus another? Whenever you bring a third party into it, there's always multiple layers of that whole his, hers, and the truth scenario, right? A lot of times, and especially if you have kids, I'd have two of my kids fighting with each other, and I go, what happened? And I get two different versions of the exact same scenario, right? So like because they're looking at it through their own set of eyes and their own sets of, in their own heart, that doesn't mean that the facts are different. It just means that the way that it impacts them is different. The same thing could apply on the U.S. government and the tribal leaders. Thinking, as you were reading, I was remembering that the scenario with the Wampanoag signing over that first deed, and I'm thinking to myself, he had no problem putting his mark on the X, because to him that piece of paper didn't mean anything.
Yeah.
He had no idea what he was signing, and no matter how you interpreted it, no matter how an interpreter looked at him and said, "Now you know when you put the your mark there, you no longer own that land. And he's going, so what? I didn't own it in the first place. Like he did,
Right.
there was a lot of lost in translation scenarios in that. And I'm wondering if that is way more impactful than we give it credit for.
Well, and there's something else here which doesn't really get pulled apart. I once saw a joke on Futurama about, and that's the Matt Groening cartoon where everybody lives in like the year 3000 or whatever.
Bender.
Yeah, and the pizza delivery,
Yeah.
pizza delivery guy Fry goes to sleep in a cryogenic chamber, wakes up in the year 3000, everything's different. And there was a Native American, it's a one-off joke in there. There was a group of Native Americans who were going to another planet or something like that. And I think it was the doctor in there, or it might have been the crab. It doesn't matter. Ask some setup. Ask them, like, why are you going to another planet? And they were like, our ancestors didn't have concept of ownership. We have concept of ownership. They like went to the other planet, and it's it's framed in that way. Again, that's why I had to contextualize it as Futurama. It's a joke, right? But there's a core of truth in there, and it is this concept of ownership. This is something that has befuddled me from the beginning. I gotta be honest. And from the beginning, I mean, back when I was like 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and started, studying, U.S. history and studying the history of multiple peoples here, as I said before on the podcast, my great-great-grandfather was a sharecropper. Like, I mean, I'm 3 generations removed from slavery. Okay, yay. And so that's where we started, right, in my house, right, and you sort of move outward in concentric circles from there. And with Black Americans, concept of ownership has been a real hard one to wrap our arms around in a whole lot of different ways, and it pops up in a whole lot of different ways because it's not a European conception of ownership. That's one of the big dynamics that I saw between native tribes in America and particularly initially the white Europeans. The concept of ownership was completely different, and that seemed to have been, particularly of the land, and that seemed to have been a big sort of zip past kind of thing. And I genuinely wonder in my heart, would there have been any way for them to explain it to each other? Like in any kind of way? Because when a European from Spain hears that I don't own the land, that literally is like want in their head. They don't know what that means.
Right.
It doesn't make any sense. Or when a member of a tribe hears from a member of the Iroquois Confederation, hears from the Dutch, we now own this land, that literally to that person sounds like want. Like they have no concept of this. So could there have been, I guess this is my question, could there have been any sort of rapprochement with different understandings of concept of ownership, or were we always going to be on this path to somebody wins and somebody loses, and it's the one who has the bigger guns that wins?
Well, I mean, the simplest answer to that is yeah, of course, right? Of course, like somebody could have. The problem is nobody. First of all, nobody at the time understood that was going to be a problem. Number one. Number two, they could they have spent a little bit more time and really, because if you think about it, if somebody said to you, as soon as you put that X on, you no longer own the land, they go, well, I didn't own it anyway, I'll put the X. And go, no, listen, make sure I understand this. Once you put the X, you're no longer allowed to hunt there, to fish there, to live there. You cannot use that land for any of your natural resources ever again. That's not that difficult to translate, right? But what I go back to my statement earlier, which was, nobody's blaming the translators for this anywhere. Like, I never hear anybody go, well, what did that translator gain out of this? Because if the translator was leaning, like really wanted to marry that chief's daughter, and he just told him whatever he wanted to hear so he could marry the chief's daughter, or getting tons of money from the government, then he's going to tell them whatever he wants. Like, nobody's blaming the interpreters, because I think that's where a lot of the, like, to your point, that's where a lot of the communication gap lies. I think it lies directly on their lap. But you also don't understand. We also don't understand. We weren't there. We don't understand what they were going through, what pressure they were under. We have no idea. You could have had a meeting of the minds, that you expected to last hours and hours and hours, and then a government official comes in and goes, no, we have 10 minutes. You got to explain this to him right now, and then we got to sign this and go. Right? Like,
Yeah.
There's a lot of dynamics that we just don't know and understand. Right? From these perspectives. Now, that being said, there is also something to be said about learning from your own mistakes. So when we see these treaties and land deeds happening, and we see them going over and over and over again, and now we should be able to learn from that directly and say, well, we're not doing that ever again. Like, we're not going to sign that ever again. And then it becomes what we ended up happening in the late 1800s, from 1865, 70 to 1880 or 1890. Really, Wounded Knee was 1890. Mm-hmm. So you get what happened there instead. So we learned our lesson. We start fighting back, and then they just destroy you because their weapons are superior, their numbers are superior, whatever that is. Even some of the only saving grace we had, even a little bit, was some of our tactics were a little better. But I say a little better, and I mean it. They were only a little better.
I don't know. Crazy Horse is pretty good.
That's what I'm saying. But that's one guy, right? Like, and that was one battle, and they absolutely won that battle. I get that. But outside of that, and that wasn't the only battle they won. There was a couple others. Chief Joseph and a couple of the others in the Nez Perce and the Utes. They had some, especially when you're talking about the deep canyon areas and stuff like that. The U.S. government had no idea how to navigate those. There was plenty of areas. I understand all that, but ultimately, we know what happened, right? Like, ultimately, they pushed it, and they just pushed forward. So, to your point, I think there was a combination of both things. I think the interpreters either failed, we learned from those failures, or B, even if they succeeded and we realized that those things weren't good enough and we wanted to go push back a little bit, the superior, and don't even get me started about the weaponry, as the weaponry itself changed throughout the course of that time frame too. As if you think about the difference between shooting off a cannon and shooting off a rifle, and then all of a sudden we have a howitzer shooting 1,000 rounds in 5 minutes. Like, it was just not even. And nobody had access to that except for the government. So,
well, and if you look at the history of warfare, not even the history of warfare, the history that's too broad. The history of European warfare, which is it's a truth, and it is a brutal one. The Europeans, out of all of the groups on the planet, were the most adept at taking tactics and material knowledge from their enemies. As I've said before on this podcast, arguing like hell about it all the way up to the point of actually developing the Spencer rifle or shooting the gun. Literally having arguments all the way to the point where the cannon is loading, and then they just go. And you don't really see that. Some of the African tribal nations had some of that history, but not widespread. China's history is too locked up and insular to make any real comparisons to anybody else. The Indian subcontinent, so much of that was destroyed. Well, not destroyed, but so much of that history was ignored. Or not referenced, at least not in the West, by the British, and didn't translate well anyway. And so when the Europeans showed up in America, even in 1492, like, and this is the other thing, in 1492, what was going on in Europe at the time? Well, in Europe at the time, the Spanish and the Dutch were both trying like hell to hold the English down.
Yeah.
Everywhere they could, and twice on Sundays. And with the French nipping at their heels, right? And it was this swirling morass of political and social change, with a sense of and we're dealing with a lot of this now because this is pre-enlightenment. Well, not pre-enlightenment. Yeah, it is. It's pre-enlightenment. So we're dealing with this now in the post-enlightenment struggle, but it was a lot of chaos and swirling agreements and these kinds of things that would have been really, really hard to explain to somebody from, like, I don't know, central Mexico. Like, I always think of the Mayans. Like, how are you going to explain all of that to Tenochtitlan? Like, how are you going to explain that to him? And would he have even cared?
Yeah.
If you'd been able to, right? So I'm not, this is not a chest thumping thing. This is more of an observation of, just like when you talk about weapons, there's a lot of different factors that come together to bring forth a Spencer rifle into existence. And it doesn't seem to me that just to keep it narrow here, that the Native American tribes seem to have had that kind of, they didn't seem to have that kind of focus or direction. Not historically, anyway.
They didn't need it. Think about this for a second. If you know anything about Native history back then, the idea or concept of getting close enough to your enemy to touch them or hit them and get back safely was a bigger feat of honor than shooting and killing somebody.
Right.
So when you have that completely different view of what is honorable and what wins, right? Like, right. I just won. Then yeah, they had no need for it. They weren't looking for destruction or annihilation of each other, although that did happen here and there in pockets. But that wasn't the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal was that to show you up, so to speak, right? Like, I can run in the middle of a battle, arrows flying everywhere. I can knock you off your horse. You can walk away with with shame, and I can go back and get treated like a hero, right? So when you have that kind of mentality in warfare, you wouldn't need or require anything that destructive.
Right.
And then when they saw it, that was like the end of they thought it was the end of the world, literally. They thought the world was going to come to an end when they saw how devastating and destructive that some of those weapons were.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then it is also referenced in here by one of the tribal elders. I don't think it's Black Kettle, but it was somebody else who basically said, the white people are just going to keep coming like locusts. They're like locusts. Yeah. They just show up and they destroy they destroy everything. Back to the book, back to Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, an Indian history of the American West. So we're going to pick up with one of these wars, Little Crow's War, a little bit later in the book. Now, once again, as usual, we're not reading the whole book. We can't. So we're picking sections from this book that I think have some interesting and some relevant lessons for leaders. And there's a particularly relevant lesson here. In the old days, he could have regained leadership by going to war. But the trees pledged him not to engage in hostilities with either the white men or other tribes. This is Little Crow. Why was it, he wondered, that the Americans talked so much of peace between themselves and the Indians, and between Indians and Indians, and yet they themselves waged such a savage war with the Graycoats that they had no money left to pay their small debt to the Santees? He knew that some of the young men in his band were talking openly of war with the white men, a war to drive them out of the Minnesota Valley. It was a good time to fight the whites, they said, because so many bluecoat soldiers were away fighting the Graycoats. Little Crow considered such talk foolish. He had been to the east and had seen the power of the Americans. They were everywhere like locusts and destroyed their enemies with great thundering cannon. War upon the white men was unthinkable. On Sunday, August 17, Little Crow attended the Episcopal Church at the Lower Agency and listened to a sermon delivered by the Reverend Samuel Hinman. At the conclusion of services, he shook hands with the other worshipers and returned to his house, which was 2 miles upriver from the agency. Late that night, Little Crow was awakened by the sound of many voices and the noisy entry of several Santees into his sleeping room. He recognized the voice of Shakopee. Something very important, something very bad had happened. Shakopee, Mankato, Medicine Bottle, and Big Eagle all had come, and they said Wabasha would soon arrive for council. 4 young men of Shakopee's band who were hungry for food had crossed the river that sunny afternoon to hunt in the big woods, and something very bad had happened there. Big Eagle told about it. They came to a settler's fence, and here they found a hen's nest with some eggs on it. One of them took the eggs, and another said, "Don't take them, for they belong to a white man, and we may get into trouble." The other was angry, for he was very hungry and wanted to eat the eggs, and he dashed them to the ground and replied, "You are a coward. You are afraid of the white man. You are afraid to take even an egg from him, though you are half starved. Yes, you are a coward, and I will tell everybody so." The other replied, "I am not a coward. I am not afraid of the white man, and to show you that I am not, I will go into the house and shoot him. Are you brave enough to go with me?" The one who called him coward said, "Yes, I will go with you, and we will see who is the braver of us two." Their two companions had said, "We will go with you, and we will be brave too." They all went into the house of the white man, but he got alarmed and went to another house where there were some other white men and a woman. The four Indians followed them and killed 3 men and 2 women. Then they hitched up a team belonging to another settler and drove to Shakope's camp and told what they had done. On hearing of the murders of the white people, Little Crow rebuked the 4 young men and then sarcastically asked Shakopee and the others why they had come to him for advice when they had chosen Traveling Hale to be their spokesman. The leaders assured Little Crow that he was still their war chief. No Santee's life would be safe now after these killings, they said. It was the white man's way to punish all Indians for the crimes of one or a few. The Santees might as well strike first instead of waiting for the soldiers to come and kill them. It would be better to fight the white men now while they were fighting among themselves far to the south. Little Crow rejected their arguments. The white men were too powerful, he said, yet he admitted the settlers would exact bitter vengeance because women had been killed. Little Crow's son, who was present, said later that his father's face grew haggard and great beads of sweat stood out on his forehead. At last, one of the young braves cried out, "Taoya te duta, Little Crow is a coward." Coward was the word that had started the killings, the challenge to the young boys, who was a young boy who was afraid to take the white man's eggs even when he was starving. Coward was not a word that a Sioux chief could take lightly, even though he was halfway down the white man's road. Little Crow's reply, as remembered by his young son, "Taoyete Duta is not a coward, and he is not a fool." When did he run away from his enemies? When did he leave his braves behind him on the warpath and turn back to his teepee? When he ran away from your enemies, he walked behind on your trail with his face to the Ojibways and covered your backs as a she-bear covers her cubs. Is Taoya Tudut without scalps? Look at his war feathers. Behold the scalp locks of your enemies hanging there on his lodge poles. Do you call him a coward? Taoya Teduta is not a coward, and he is not a fool. Braves, you are like little children. You know not what you are doing. You are full of the white man's devil water. You like dogs. You are like dogs in the hot moon when they run mad and snap at their own shadows. We are only little herds of buffalo left scattered. The great herds that once covered the prairies are no more. See, the white men are like locusts when they fly so thick that the whole sky is a snowstorm. You may kill 1, 2, 10, yes, as many as the leaves in the forest yonder, and their brothers will not miss them. Kill 1, 2, 10, and 10 times 10 times 10 will come to kill you. Count your fingers all day long, and the white men with guns in their hands will come faster than you can count. Yes, they fight among themselves a way off. Do you hear the thunder of their big guns? No. It would take you 2 moons to run down to where they are fighting, and all the way your path will be among white soldiers as thick as tamaracks in the swamps of the Ojibways. Yes, they fight among themselves, but if you strike at them, they will all turn on you and devour you and your women and little children, just as the locusts of their time fall on the trees and devour all the leaves in one day. You are fools. You cannot see the face of your chief. Your eyes are full of smoke. You cannot hear his voice. Your ears are full of roaring waters. Braves, you are little children. You are fools. You will die like the rabbits when the hungry wolves hunt them in the hard moon of January. Taoya Teduta is not a coward. He will die with you. Big Eagle then spoke of peace, but he was shouted down. 10 years of abuse by white men, the broken treaties, the lost hunting grounds, the unkept promises, the undelivered annuities, their hunger for food while the agency warehouses overflowed with it, the insulting words of Andrew Myrick, all rose up to put the murders of the white settlers in to the background. There are no winners in a clash of civilizations, just the dead and the survivors. And if Elon Musk's recent quip is to be believed, you might want one to let the losers have access to Wikipedia with plenty of time on their hands to edit it. That passage right there indicates a change, right? A fundamental worldview shift. And those fundamental worldviews, fundamentally held, clashed in the North American West. As Tom and I were just talking about, I don't think by this point in time in history, and this would be in the 1860s during the American Civil War, that the native tribes were blind to that fact, because they already had almost 350 years of experience with Europeans by this point. And so they weren't blind to the fact that there was going to be violence if they went down a certain road. And neither were, of course, the white folks. But once the violence started, there was little to stop it. And that's what Little Crow was really worried about. He was trying to protect something. He was trying to be an honorable man in a dishonorable time. And I don't think either side fully understood how far things were going to go once the wheels fell off. And I think that this is something that is fundamental for leaders to understand as well. Yes, you have to know what your enemy is capable of, but you also have to imagine what it is capable of for you to do, and then apply that to your enemy, and then go a step further than that. And I think both sides failed to do that. That word coward is interesting in that passage, because the enemy gets a vote. The enemy gets a vote on your strategy. The enemy gets a vote on your tactics. And the enemy even gets a vote on your doctrine, the reasons why you're doing the things that you do. And the enemy gets a vote once you start down the road of violence. Pride, national heritage, right of existence, rapacious greed, all of this comes together in Little Crow's War in Minnesota during the Civil War. A shameful incident, and that is the appropriate term to use, that even went before Abraham Lincoln. And even Abraham Lincoln made the wrong choice on this one. Little Crow's War is an example of that fundamental clash of worldviews, Tom. What was Little Crow's options? Could he have stopped the war drums from beating? Was there any way he could have stopped that train from moving, or were things way too far down the tracks by the time we get to the egg stealing? And it could have just been anything that would have lit that spark.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that. If it could have been, personally, I think it could have been anything. The egg stealing was just that last straw, right? Like that last ditch effort thing, and I mean, again, you think about what.
By the way, I think he's one of the most tragic leaders in this entire book is Little Crow. By the way, I want to go on record as saying that, he knew probably as much as maybe Geronimo and Sitting Bull much later would know. Like, he knew exactly what he was dealing with.
Yeah.
And yet he seemed to be unable to, he couldn't put a brake on the train.
No, but because, again, there's a lot of dynamics here, like where if you think about today's version of this, right? And if you think through this logically, he could have just literally the men who went and stole the eggs and killed the settlers, he could have literally walked them down to the police station and said, I know these guys are guilty, here you go, do with them what you will, and walk away and everybody be happy, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we think through this logically, that makes sense. But at the time and who they were and how you can't do that, because you're fundamentally charged with protecting your people, and that your people's rights matter more than the next person, like the people that you don't know, or the people that are not supposed to be there according to their their thought process, right? You're not supposed to be here anyway, so the fact that you're dead is irrelevant to us because you're not supposed to be here. Mm-hmm. And he was stuck between that rock and the hard place of knowing how he could get out of it relatively easily from the government and the white and the settlers' perspective, he would have never been able to remain the chief.
Right.
Right. So, and then remaining the chief, he knows he has no other path but to go to war. And the honorable thing for him to do is to defend and ride and die with his people, right?
Yeah.
And I think to your point, I mean, he's in a lose-lose situation. There's no way he can win at this.
Mm-hmm.
He either stops the war, gives up his people, and then his people are probably going to kill him at that point. Let's just call a spade a spade. It's not like they're just going to go, oh, you gave up these. We don't want you here anymore. Go leave. No. That's not how that works. Yeah. You chose them over your people. He probably would have got killed anyway. So I think he's in a rock and a hard place. There was no room for him to win in this scenario.
Well, and to explain to your people that, and this is a lesson for leaders here, and he tried in his sort of oratory there, his soliloquy, his final words, such as it were. When you try to explain to your people exactly what the outcome is going to be if we go down this road. And I mean, we even see this in, I'm sure you see this in projects you're involved in. I've seen this in projects I'm involved in, when the leader does try to actually be that transparent with folks to the best of their ability, and people still don't understand. Yeah. They still want to bankrupt the company, or they still want to engage in corruption, or they still want to either, or let's say they want to go do something positive, right? They still want to go do something positive that will save the market and save the industry, but it's going to cost the entire company its existence. And you explain to them in raw detail exactly what is about to occur, and they still go and do it anyway. There's nothing that's more demoralizing for a leader.
Yeah.
How do you navigate a lose-lose situation? I mean, Little Crow, here's the way he did it. It's like, okay, I guess we're going to go have a war then. Fine. And he just sort of went and had a war. And, you know, there's no claps for that.
No.
And I told you so doesn't really quite cut it, right? Like it doesn't, you can't really say that at the end, although you may want to as a leader.
No, and I think especially from a leadership perspective, and we're trying to, and we've done this many times on this podcast, where we're trying to take something from 200, 500, 1,000 years ago and trying to kind of mold it into our modern day view, right? The simplest question there is how do you navigate a lose-lose situation? The easiest version is to try to navigate toward the lesser of two evils, right? If you know both paths are going to be a losing battle, you have to try to at least lead it toward the direction of the lesser of the two evils. And I think that he tried, and I think he still failed at that, because there was no compromise either, right? Like, so back in that day, there was no compromise. You either lived or died. Success or failure was determined by life or death, life or death, or eradication of the area. So you talked earlier about, the Wampanoag and King Philip. Mm-hmm. The King Philip's War in 1675, which is a precursor to a lot of this stuff, by the way. If you don't know much about the King Philip's War, a lot of how the government and a lot of how things were handled were basically viewed by this, because one of the things that happened that most people don't realize, King Philip or MetaCom would go throughout New England trying to get people to join his fight to push back the colonists. And in doing so, he divided his own people. Like the native people, 50% of them said, no, peace out, we're out. And a lot of the Abenaki in the northern part of Massachusetts, southern New Hampshire, southern Vermont, southern Maine, they just fled to deeper woods. So they basically resettled around St. Lawrence River area in Canada. So now MetaCom has half the people, and out of that half, about half of them decided to fight with him. The other half were like, if we don't assimilate, we're going to die. So they became like the praying Indians of Natick and the praying Indian, so they converted to Christianity, and they didn't side with the colonists from a fighting standpoint. They took a peaceful route, and they just didn't want to fight anymore. So they went the praying route. So now he went from 100% to 25% of a fighting force and didn't win, right? So now you take that same model westward. The government knew exactly how to do this. They were looking at King Philip's War going, all we have to do is divide and conquer. We push hard enough. Some people will fight, some people won't, some people will flee, some people won't, which is why, like, if you look at the original, they talk about the Ojibwe in this particular segment. If you look at the Ojibwe territory prior to Western expansion, it was much larger. Now it's up in the northern peninsula of Michigan. So that's what they did it. Like, they knew what they were doing, right? Like they had this idea or concept of how to win this as they went westward. Now, granted, I was going to say the C word, credit. I'm not going to give credit, but I will say that there were people that were trying to do better as we went, and they also failed. But that's that goes back to what I was saying earlier about what was there really to gain about peaceful negotiations? What was there really to gain about lack of loss and interpretation things? Like there was a lot of other things in factor, but if you look at the version of King Philip's War and then the westward expansion, there were a lot of mirrored tactics from the both government, and responses from the native side were similar. Like that's what I'm saying. Okay. Like there was they're
kind of trapped in a cul-de-sac of action and reaction. Okay.
Yeah.
Buddy of mine back in college, he was actually from Tennessee. And we both went to college at Bemidji State University, speaking of the Ojibwe. and so that's where I got a lot of this information about Little Crow's War. And actually I knew a lot about it before I even read this book. But buddy of mine from Tennessee made the point, and it's not a terrible one, but I want to bounce this idea off of you. If we just left the buffalo alone, like you just let the buffalo walk around, they're freaking cows. The buffalo, the trains, the native peoples hunting the buffalo, it probably would have all worked itself out by like 1920, maybe 1930 at the latest. Like the West would have been quote unquote settled by settlers, by Europeans. The buffalo would have been roaming. You'd still have 30 million buffalo running around. Now the pushback that I always gave him was, you can't have a buffalo walking across the interstate in St. Louis. Like you can't. That's untenable.
Why not? We have deer that walk around Boston.
Right. This is right, which is exactly what he pushed back with. He's like, but people hit a deer all the time. Nobody complains.
Exactly.
Well, no, people complain all the time.
Yeah, hitting just for the record, hitting a buffalo would be a hell of a lot worse than hitting a deer. I'm just saying.
For sure. I remember driving through like Yellowstone, or driving past Yellowstone. No, northern Montana. I was driving to northern Montana one time to go to a rugby tournament in Washington State, and I just remember driving at night, and a buffalo just like walked up near the van or whatever, and I was like, oh, okay, that's what we're dealing with.
These are not furry cows, people. All the idiots you see in Yellowstone trying to pet them that get hurt, they deserve it.
They deserve it. There's a reason. So
anyway, sorry.
But his idea, like if we just left the buffalo, like, okay, maybe not 30 million, 5 million buffalo, just there's vast tracts of the middle of this country where there's nothing between like Omaha, Nebraska and the base of the Rocky Mountains. Just turn them all into one area and leave them there. Like why would that have not been? And I know, you had hunters that shot the buffalo from the railroads or from the trains, and then left the bodies to rot. And that was all part of it's sort of like, trading in smallpox rugs. Like it's an intentional destruction of of the basic cornerstone of a human civilization. Okay. If that hadn't happened, this was my buddy's contention. If that hadn't happened, could we have worked out a separate piece?
May I'll say maybe, because I'm not completely convinced, because the buffalo were not the only thing. There were other factors involved, right? There
Sure.
was
Yeah.
gold rushes. There were certain mineral deposits that would have potentially caused the same rift just a little bit later. It would have taken a little longer, right? So rather than the Indian Wars of the 1865 to 1890, maybe they would have been from 75 to 1910 or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, I think we would have just been pushing the inevitable down the path, because there are other things involved, and then just the buffalo weren't the resource the people were after. The buffalo, in killing them in droves the way they did, was the mechanism they used to basically destroy their way of life, right? The way of life of the natives there. So if we didn't do that, and then we said, oh, but by the way, we want to mine these hills over here that you find sacred, that you're going to work, like, we don't go there anymore, don't worship it. They would have had a similar conflict. I just think it would have been an inevitability. Now, that being said, if there was a way, I see the one thing I don't think there was a way to convince them, let us pull all these deposits out of here, and then you can have the hills back, because we won't care about them anymore, right? Like, and to the people, to the native people, they still would have been sacred, because they're not thinking that they're sacred because there's gold in the hills, or there's silver, or whatever other mineral they're pulling out of there.
Yeah.
They're sacred for spiritual reasons.
Spiritual reasons.
I don't know if that would have been able to translate if they just said, hey, let us go pull this out, we'll close the mine back up, and it's back to yours. Something would not have been worked there either. So I just don't. I don't think it would have. I don't know.
Okay. All right. I'll go back and tell him. Yeah, I know he's not listening, but yeah, I'll go back and tell him you're off your rocker. It was about the gold and the silver, which I want to. We'll revisit this in our next little section here, where we talk a little bit about Red Cloud's war. But the mining of the American West, coming on the heels of the Civil War, was not an accident. In the rapacious sort of robber baron treatment of the natural resources was not an accident. It was not. And it took me reading this book to kind of get that click over of like multiple layers of information that I've had for years to just sort of all, sort of collapse into one thesis in my head. And the thesis is, I'll just go ahead and say it. The thesis is, you're right. We were going to have wars. The United States government was going to have wars with the Native American tribal cultures of the West because they had to. And I don't mean had to as in they intentionally chose that course of action. I actually fundamentally believe that Grant and Sherman and all those guys that came out of, not Sheridan, he was a different kind of guy, but the guys that came out of the Civil War and saw great death and destruction were so psychologically traumatized by that. And of course, we didn't use those terms then, because this is before psychiatry. So why would we? But they were so psychologically traumatized that they believed their best move was continuous rapacious expansion because of financial means, because everybody was trying to get rich. Money was going to solve everything. Money was going to fix the South. Money was going to fix the dynamics between blacks and whites. Money was going to be an appropriate replacement for the 750,000 dead people and the material destruction of the South, the Southern United States. Money was going to be the solution for the robber barons, the J.P. Morgans and the Andrew Carnegies and all those folks that arose in the backwash of the American Civil War. Money was going to solve all of it. And the number one place where you could get money, because they didn't inflate the currency. This is the other thing that people forget. Up until 1916, when the 16th Amendment was passed and taxation was finally, put to the U.S. Constitution, the vast majority of the money that the American government had came from foreign tariffs. Well, foreign trade in cotton, which was a huge moneymaker for the United States overall, basically stopped at the end of the Civil War. And so the US government had massive debts that they had to pay to themselves. And they had they couldn't inflate the currency because there was no way to do that. The currency was tied to gold and silver. And so gold and silver is limited. And so what are you going to need? You're going to need to go get more gold and silver. And where is that? Well, it ain't underneath Boston. They've already looked. And it ain't underneath Virginia. They already looked there too. So where are you going to go? And by the way, most of that mining that occurred in the West was not nearly as robust as was originally advertised.
Yeah.
So I think this was one of those confederacy of circumstances and events where, quite frankly, the people had events happen to them that were kind of outside of their control. Don't say I'm not going to say that they weren't responsible. They were responsible. And there were these events that were occurring outside of their control. So that's just a thesis that I have in my head. Am I onto something, or am I just wandering in the woods?
Well, I mean, I think you might be. Yeah, I think you might be. But you're basically saying what I'm saying. You're just saying it differently. So we're saying the same thing. You're saying that it was an inevitability, and I'm saying it was an inevitability. I'm talking about Buffalo, and you're talking about
talk about taxation and tariffs.
Talking about debt, debt, taxation and debt. So yeah, we're not on. We're at least reading the same book. We're not on the same page, but we're reading the same book.
We're reading the same book. Well, and the Native Americans didn't care about any of this.
No.
They're like, that's, as my father would have said back in the day, that sounds like white people with white problems. Like I don't need to worry about any of that. And yet still those problems all spilled over onto them.
Sure.
And they're, I don't know. Again, I want to be careful not to put my morality on people in the past. I want to be very careful not to do that because I don't know all the circumstances, to your point. And I only know what I read in books. So speaking of which, back to the book. Back to Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. By the way, I typically say this. I am reading we are reading today, the Bantam Books paperback version of this book, published in 1973, the 19th printing. By the way, the title, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, comes from some lines from a Stephen Vincent Benet, I believe it's a poem, actually. I shall not be there, I shall rise and pass, bury my heart at Wounded Knee. Stephen Vincent Benet was a poet of the Civil War period in the United States. So we're going to turn the corner and we're going to kind of look at another war here, Red Cloud's War, and we're going to pick up with we're going to pick up with we're going to pick up with some information about some things that are happening at Fort Phil Kearny. By the way, I've been to Kearny, Nebraska. Shout out to all the folks who work at the university there. Other than the university, there is nothing in Kearny, Nebraska. By the way, everybody who lives there knows that. I'm not saying anything that's out of turn. During the summer raiding, two Oglalas, High Backbone and Yellow Eagle, had made names for themselves with their carefully planned stratagems for tricking the soldiers, as well as for reckless horsemanship and daring hand-to-hand attacks after the soldiers fell into their traps. High Backbone and Yellow Eagle sometimes worked with Young Crazy Horse in planning their elaborate decoys. Early in the moon of popping trees, they began tantalizing the woodcutters in the pinery and the soldiers guarding the wagons, which brought wood to Fort Phil Kearny. On December 6th, a day with a cold wash of air flowing down the slopes of the Bighorns, High Backbone and Yellow Eagle took about 100 warriors and dispersed them at various points along the Pinery Road. Red Cloud was with another group of warriors who took positions along the ridge tops. They flashed mirrors and waved high flags to signal the movements of the troops to High Backbone and his decoys. Before the day was over, the Indians had the bluecoats dashing about in all directions. At one time, the little white chief Carrington came out and gave chase. Choosing just the right moment, Crazy Horse dismounted and showed himself on the trail in front of one of Carrington's hot-blooded young cavalry officers, who immediately led a file of soldiers galloping in pursuit. As soon as the soldiers were strung out along the narrow trail, Yellow Eagle and his warriors sprang from concealment in their rear. In a matter of seconds, the Indians swarmed over the soldiers. This was the fight in which Lieutenant Horatio Bingham and Sergeant G.R. Bowers were killed, and several soldiers severely wounded. In their camps that night and for several days following, the chiefs and warriors talked of how foolishly the Bluecoats had acted. Red Cloud was sure that if they could entice a large number of troops out of the fort, 1,000 Indians armed with only bows and arrows could kill them all. Sometime during the week, the chiefs agreed that after the coming of the next full moon, they would prepare a great trap for the little white chief and his soldiers. By the third week of December, everything was in readiness, and about 2,000 warriors began moving south of the lodges along near the tongue. The weather was very cold, and they wore buffalo robes with the hair turned in, leggings of dark woolen cloth, high-topped buffalo fur moccasins, and carried red Hudson's Bay blankets strapped to their saddles. Most of them rode pack horses, leading their fast-footed war ponies by lariats. Some had rifles, and most were armed with bows and arrows, knives, and lances. They carried enough pemmican to last several days, and when an opportunity offered, small groups would turn off the trail, kill a deer, and take as much meat as could be carried on their saddles. About 10 miles north of Fort Phil Kearny, they made a temporary camp in the three circles of Sioux, Cheyennes, and Arapahoes. Between the camp and the fort was the place selected for the ambush, the little valley of Pennow Creek. On the morning of December 21, the chiefs and medicine men decided the day was favorable for a victory. In the first gray light of dawn, a party of warriors started off in a wide circuit toward the wood train road, where they were to make a feint against the wagons. 10 young men had already been chosen for the dangerous duty of decoying the soldiers. 2 Cheyennes, 2 Arapahoes, and 2 from each of the 3 Sioux divisions, Oglalas, Miniconjos, and Brules. Crazy Horse, Hump, and Little Wolf were the leaders. While the decoys mounted and started off toward Lodge Trail Ridge, the main body of warriors moved down the Bozeman Road. Patches of snow and ice lay along the shady sides of the ridges, but the day was bright and the air cold and dry. About 3 miles from the fort, where the road ran along a narrow ridge and descended to Pennow Creek, they began laying a great ambush. The Cheyennes and Arapahoes took the west side. Some of the Sioux hid in a grassy flat on the opposite side. Others remained mounted and concealed themselves behind 2 rocky ridges. By mid-morning, almost 2,000 warriors were waiting there for the decoys to bring the Bluecoats into the trap. While the war party was making its feint across the wood train, Crazy Horse and the decoys dismounted and waited in concealment on a slope facing the fort. At the first sound of a gunfire, a company of soldiers dashed out of the fort and galloped off to rescue the woodcutters. As soon as the Bluecoats were out of sight, the decoys showed themselves on the slope and moved down closer to the fort. Crazy Horse waved his red blanket and darted in and out of the brush that fringed the frozen piney. After a few minutes of this, little soldier chief of the fort fired off his big twice-shooting gun. The decoys scattered along the slope, jumping, zigzagging, and yelling to make the soldiers believe they were frightened. By this time, the war party had withdrawn from the wood train and doubled back toward the Lodge Trail Ridge. In a few minutes, the soldiers came in pursuit, some mounted, some on foot. They were commanded by Captain William J. Fetterman, who had explicit orders not to pursue beyond Lodge Trail Ridge. Crazy Horse and the other decoys now jumped on their ponies and began riding back and forth along the slope of Lodge Trail Ridge, taunting the soldiers and angering them so that they fired recklessly. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks, and the decoys moved back slowly. When the soldiers slowed their advance or halted, Crazy Horse would dismount and pretend to adjust his bridle or examine his pony's hooves. Bullets whined all around him, and then the soldiers finally moved up on the ridgetop to chase the decoys down towards Pennow Creek. They were the only Indians in sight, only 10 of them, and the soldiers were charging their horses to catch them. When the decoys crossed Pennow Creek, all 81 of the cavalrymen and infantrymen were within the trap. Now the decoys divided into 2 parties and quickly rode across each other's trail. This was the signal for attack. Little Horse, the Cheyenne, who a year earlier gave warning to the Arapahoes of General Connor's approach, had the honor of signaling his people, who were concealed in gullies on the west side. He raised his lance, and all the mounted Cheyennes and Arapahoes charged with a sudden thunder of hooves. From the opposite side came the Sioux, and for a few minutes the Indians and the walking soldiers were mixed and confused hand-to-hand fighting. The infantrymen were soon all killed, but the cavalrymen retreated to a rocky height near the end of the ridge. They turned their horses loose and tried to take cover among the ice-crusted boulders. Little Horse made a name for himself that day, leaping over the rocks in and out of gullies until he was within 40 feet of the besieged cavalrymen. White Bull of the Miniconjos also distinguished himself in the bloody fighting on the hillside. Armed only with a bow and a lance, he charged a dismounted cavalryman who was fighting at him with a carbine. In a pictograph that White Bull later drew of the event, he showed himself clad in a red war cape, firing an arrow into the soldier's heart and cracking him over the head with his lance to count first coup. Toward the end of the fighting, the Cheyennes and the Arapahoes on one side and the Sioux on the other were so close together that they began hitting each other with their showers of arrows. Then it was all over. Not a soldier was left alive. A dog came out from the dead, and the Sioux started to catch it to take it home with him. But Big Rascal, a Cheyenne, said, "Don't let the dog go." And somebody shot it with an arrow. This was the fight the white men called the Fetterman Massacre. The Indians called it the Battle of the 100 Slain. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to the conclusions that people drew.
Can I just say?
Yeah,
can I just say something real quick? I'm sorry.
Yes.
I know the flow of these things. Usually, you read, we talk. You read, we talk. But there was something in that real quick that I just want to make sure that people understand. Did you notice the difference of definition? The white definition was the massacre, blah blah blah. The native definition was the battle of love. So when the natives viewed things, it was viewed as like like this back and forth, like we're gonna win, you're gonna win, or we're gonna lose, you're gonna lose, whatever that is. But it's a win-lose battle. Every time the white people lost, it was a massacre.
It was a massacre.
Every time they won, it was a great victory.
Oh, you see this repeatedly. You see this repeatedly, and actually, this is reflected in what I'm about.
So go ahead. I just wanted to point out that distinction.
Oh yeah, with a difference. Oh, we're going to talk about that coming up next. Oh yeah, because I want to talk about this Colonel Carrington cat. The Fetterman Massacre made a profound impression upon Colonel Carrington. He was appalled by the mutilations, the disembowelments, the hacked limbs, the private parts severed and indecently placed on the person. He brooded upon the reasons for such savagery and eventually wrote an essay on the subject, philosophizing that the Indians were compelled by some paganistic belief to commit the terrible deeds that remained forever in his mind. Had Colonel Carrington visited the scene of the Sand Creek Massacre, which occurred only 2 years before the Fetterman Massacre, he would have seen the same mutilations committed upon Indians by Colonel Chivington's soldiers. The Indians who ambushed the Fettermen were only imitating their enemies, a practice which in warfare, as in civilian life, is said to be the sincerest form of flattery. The Fetterman Massacre also made a profound impression upon the United States government. It was the worst defeat the Army had yet suffered in Indian warfare, and the second in American history for which came no survivors. Carrington was recalled from command, reinforcements were sent to the forts to the Powder River country, and a new peace commission was dispatched from Washington to Fort Laramie. Yeah. So, if there's anybody that probably deserved to get killed early on in this book, actually, no, let me frame it this way. If I had a time machine and I could go back and have a fist fight with anybody, I'd go have a fist fight with Colonel Carrington. I'd have a fist fight with that guy. There's not going to be any like polite dueling or anything. I'm just going to walk up to that grown man. I'm going to smack him in the mouth, and then we're going to be on like Donkey Kong. Yeah. And because, I'm probably going to lose that one, it's fine. It'll be worth it. It'll be worth it. I never read in my life. No, I can't say never. There are a few times in U.S. military history when I read about just blinkered command. And there is no better example of blinkered command than Colonel Carrington. Just absolutely blinkered command. The guy had no clue what he was doing and was led around by ideology and by the end of his nose. And he has a constitutional he was constitutionally incapable of seeing Indians as human beings, which, by the way, this is something that is reflected throughout every massacre or battle that you see, there's one commander or two sometimes in the United States government who are just constitutionally incapable of seeing the Native American tribal people as being, people with their own motives, their own ideas, their own thought process, and God forbid, their own resistance.
It doesn't get much better, by the way.
Oh no, it doesn't. No, it doesn't.
It just continues. Well, oh God, what's his name? I just lost his name. Save the man, kill the Indian. He started the boarding schools. Like he started all the like the whole. It doesn't get any better. I mean, even from the U.S. government standpoint, we weren't people until 1924 when they gave us citizenship. We weren't even citizens of the United States until 1924.
I don't understand this.
So here's
wait, no. Here's the thing. You're people enough to kill. Yeah, that's what I thought. That's what I thought. Nobody stood up in any meeting anywhere in any room and said, they're people enough for us to kill.
Well, here, let me put
crickets. Like that's all I'm going to get is crickets for everybody around the table. All y'all smart people, all y'all's titles. You're just going to get crickets.
Let me put some perspective on this though, because I don't think it was zero. I don't think it was none. I don't think it was zero people that stood up in those meetings. But I think what did happen was anybody who stood up in those meetings got shushed very quickly. I think about it. I mean, Grant himself appointed the first Native person in charge of Indian affairs in Quanah Parker, right? Like Quanah Parker. Right. And that wasn't good enough. Like that still didn't solve the problem. Right. Having somebody who is Native in charge of Native American affairs at the government level, at the top level, federal government level, did not solve the problem. So I think the problem was back to what you're talking about a few minutes ago, where at the ground level, on the front, on the Western Front, there was nobody. There was very few people in leadership roles that viewed the Native people as human beings. It didn't matter that people in Boston or New York or Philadelphia. It didn't matter that those people, those philanthropic people, whatever, like whomever was standing up in those meetings, crying out, saying, "Wait, but they're people too. Wait, but they're people." It didn't matter because they weren't on the front, and they weren't directly communicating with people on the front. The president himself was not directly communicating with people on the front. So none of that mattered. It was the only way that we would have been, if you recognized it early enough and you replaced those commanders that you're talking about with people who did view natives as human.
And there were several who did, by the way.
There were a few that did. I'm not saying there weren't, but I'm saying if you were to eliminate those people like Carrington throughout the course of the Western Front, maybe this would have been different. Maybe. I'm not saying it would have, but a maybe.
Well, the governor of Colorado, who basically, no, something else just clicked over into my head. But the governor of Colorado and Colonel Carrington and Shivington, and you're right, the folks who started the boarding schools. What was it they called Custer? Hard saddle or hard nose Custer or whatever. Like all these people. And even, by the way, the settlers, right? So even the settlers failed to see the humanity of the natives, right?
Right.
And again, in our time, we chalk this up to race because race is the original sin. But I don't think it's about that. Sure, okay, there's elements of that, but it's not the core of the thing. When you dehumanize your enemy, then you can do anything you want to him.
Right.
We saw this during the 20th century in places like Russia and Germany. We also saw it in places where the United States intervened, like in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War and in Cuba. And we also saw it, interestingly enough, in the American acquisition of Hawaii in the 1950s. When you dehumanize your enemy, then they have no agency, and then they're just an object that you can just move. and philosophizing or brooding about this the way Carrington did after the Battle of 100 Slain, doesn't actually get you anywhere. It's just masturbation. It's not, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't cause you to make any changes. It does, however, build resiliency in your enemy, because now they kind of are getting a clue as to what they're actually dealing with, but it also gives them permission to dehumanize you. And then we're just in a race to the bottom after that. One of the things that D. Brown wrote this book to do was to combat against the idea of manifest destiny, which I think probably held more sway in America pre-1970. I think a lot of that started to fall apart in the 1960s and 1970s. And I don't think that anybody who's listening to this podcast now, who was born within the last 40 years, has a concept of what manifest destiny actually was. And by the way, if you explained it to them, they would poo-poo all of that because no one believes in the West anymore. That's how I frame it. No one believes in the West anymore. No, I don't think whole lot of people hold those philosophical structures in their heads. And you talk about this in terms of, and I want to kind of visit this a little bit. You talk about this in terms of communicating with people back east, right? And how the people back east couldn't possibly understand what it is that we're dealing with out here. But you only really get that if the country is vast and untamable and wild, and you're out there having an adventure. You're the Daniel Day-Lewis character in There Will Be Blood. Like, you're that guy. By the way, that guy would have hunted his own character in The Last of the Mohegans. That's what's really interesting. Like, he would have eliminated his own character in The Last of the Mohegans, if you think about that.
Last of the Mohicans, by the way, was a good movie. Just for the record,
it was an excellent movie, and we will be reading that book, by the way, on the podcast coming up here shortly for this month. So I guess my question here, or my thought, maybe we can riff on this a little bit, is number one, why doesn't anybody believe in manifest destiny anymore? And number two, because I have some thoughts on that, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. But then number two, are books like D. Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, or The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, which I've referenced now a couple of times, do books and writing like that sort of begin to erode all of that away? And if so, what do you replace it with? Because there's two oceans that separate this continent from everything else on the planet. And this is what I would like. Sometimes people from Africa, when they study the history of slavery in America, I had this happen to me a lot in college, would ask me, well, do you ever want to go back to Africa? And I'm like, back to what? Like, what am I don't know anybody there. That ain't where I was born. I was born here. Good, bad, ugly, or indifferent. So back to what exactly? Or for someone who is of Native American descent, back to what? This is it. This is the whole thing. There's nowhere to go back to. As a matter of fact, interestingly enough, Geronimo, I think it was Geronimo. No, it wasn't Geronimo. It was Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull winds up yelling at a bunch of people. And he's like, why don't you Europeans go back and fight over there? Which I thought was kind of interesting and ironic in a whole bunch of different ways. What do we do with all of that pile of American history? Because I think that is our massive struggle right now in America, is we don't know number one, we don't have a direction forward. That's number one. But then number two, we don't know where to go, and also how to integrate the past into all of that. Like, we have no idea of how to do that. And I don't know that books like Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee help us do the integration, but they do help us figure out what all the problems were, right?
They help us understand the flaws, for sure.
Yeah.
Again, think about it though. Like, you're talking manifest destiny. If you think about, I mean, you're essentially saying that you have a God-given right to do what you're about to do. That's what manifest destiny basically tells you.
Correct.
Right?
There's an element of cultural pride attached to it. Yes, absolutely.
Right.
Cultural confidence.
Right. this westward expansion was it was our destiny. God gave us this. God gave us the right to be able to do this. God gave us the power to do this because we can, right? Like
Right.
it's the whole like so I think part of why, like to your point, why some of that stuff isn't quite happening anymore. I mean, actually, I'm not so sure it's not happening anymore, by the way. I think we've just changed the narrative of it. Now it's technology and AI driven and all this other stuff on the left hand side over here. And I'm not talking about left hand, right hand political sides. I'm just that's not it. But I'm saying I'm not so sure that we don't do this anymore. Think about the dangers that people have warned us about AI. We've got plenty of movies about how but yet we move forward anyway. Why? Because it's our God-given right to do so, and we have the power to do so. It's the same reasoning, and we have no idea. We have no idea what's going to happen if we actually get to the point where some of those movies become true. We have no idea what's going to happen, right?
So, tell you what, if they turn on Skynet, you'll be the first to know.
Exactly, right. So, but my point to that is I'm not so sure that it's not there anymore. I think we have changed what it looks like. I think that we still do it. We just do it in a different way. Now, what I do think that has dramatically changed is we've globalized it a bit. We've definitely looked at this and said it's not so much a white European Anglo-Saxon thing that is manifest destiny going forward, or any other that we've thought of in the past, whether it was the Mongols or the Huns or any of the, like, they felt that it was their God-given right to go, take over these villages throughout Asia. Okay, so I think we've done it. We've globalized it a little bit, right? We're saying it's the human race's manifest destiny to do this. Okay. So we look at it more collectively now. I think that doesn't make it any more right. It doesn't make it any more like we're still not learning the. Have we ever said on this podcast, hey, son, once or twice that the more things change, the more things stay the same? I think we might have mentioned that more than once, right? Like, so as we're not learning from our own God-forsaken mistakes. Like, we're looking at things that have happened. Attila the Hun, Hitler's, Julius Caesar. It doesn't matter. Pick one. The manifest destiny here in the westward expansion of the United States. We continue to repeat these mistakes. We just rename them. We change them. We change the narrative a little bit to make us feel like it's different. Like it make us feel like it's a different posture. Or if it's, but is it really? Is it really different? Now you can talk about. I would
push back on that a little bit. I think
you can because I can push back on it too. I understand there's differences. I do know that, but I'm saying, and the one thing we haven't encountered yet that will prove or disprove my theory here. Is life somewhere else. So if we find life somewhere else and we go, oh, good, look at this, Earthlings are going to go do this because we can. We haven't learned anything.
Okay, so is manifest destiny then merely a two-word appellation or explanation, not appellation, two-word explanation for human behavior?
Yes. Absolutely. And we can direct it towards several points in what we're talking about here, right? Again, whether it's dehumanizing a civilization, whether it's dehumanizing communication, because now we're using AI and ChatGPT. We're not even writing our own stuff anymore.
I wrote this entire episode today. I don't know who you're talking to. I wrote this entire episode today. Don't get it twisted, sir. Get it right. I wrote this entire thing.
I mean, we have writers in Hollywood going on strike because they're afraid of ChatGPT taking over their jobs.
Yeah, wow.
My point is that like it's so I think one thing that we can say we might have gained is the whole manifest destiny, this whole righting of wrongs and being able to. I tell people all the time, if it wasn't for hindsight, I'd be blind, right? Hindsight is always 20/20 because you can see it in the past a lot more clearly than you can see the future. If we don't learn from it, if we don't take lessons from it and try to at least formulate the future in a better path, then shame on us. But yet we still continue to do that. Oh, I mean, think about it. We thought after World War II there would be no more wars. Like World War II was the war to end all wars.
And then
Yeah, sorry.
World War
And
One.
then World War One, and then World War Two came, and then Korea came, and then Vietnam came, and now we have this Middle East stuff. It's not ended anything.
So okay, so the question then is, with all of that being said, the question then is, are we better at counting the cost? So if you talk about technologies, let's use this as an example. We did a whole review on the movie Oppenheimer. You should go listen to that. Okay. Building of the atomic bomb. Since the atomic bomb, deaths in warfare have declined precipitously globally. Even today, in the middle of the Ukraine war, where Russia doesn't publish its own war dead and the Ukrainians don't publish their own war dead because they're both playing propaganda games on social media with the new technology, the number of deaths in that war right there are going to probably wind up less than the deaths that were in Iraq and Afghanistan. And over the course of 20 years, we wound up losing something like 8,000 people in 20 years. That's nothing. That's nothing. Now, we're not counting civilian deaths and those kinds of things. If you count civilian deaths in and all that, it's still far under the deaths that were in World War II. That it can be directly traced to the technology of the atomic bomb scaring the absolute living snot out of everyone on the planet. And even now in the Russian-Ukraine war, Russia talks about, well, we'll do this or we'll do that, or if you send this, we'll send that. And everybody holds their breath because no one wants to have nukes, and I've said this before on this podcast, I always ask the question, why would Vladimir Putin blow up the Ukraine? You still have to freaking occupy it. So right, I still think we're further down the road away from nuclear war than we are close to it. I actually think we're not. It sells a lot of newspapers and gets a lot of clicks to say nuclear war for a reason, by the way, for a reason. And that's that's an old boogeyman that has now come back after being on pause for 30 years. Okay.
Right.
Okay. Have we gotten better at counting the cost? Have we gotten, because of work like what D. Brown does and by the way, other folks who are going into history, who are pulling out the dark parts of history and saying, this is what we did, this is why it wasn't right. Maybe that's the beneficial side of doing that sort of anthropological work, which, by the way, a lot of people don't like that work, and not just in this country, but in other countries, because it indicts that cultural confidence. It puts it on trial and finds it guilty. And we don't like that as human beings.
Well, because in the past, the history was always written by the winners, right? So now we're looking at it from both sides of the coin, and we didn't do that before. And I think, to your point, I think that goes directly to what we were talking about earlier with Little Crow and trying to pick the lesser of two evils. That's all this is now, is us trying to make sure that we pick the lesser of two evils.
Okay. So are we going to pick the lesser of two evils when we find that bacterial microbe on planet X?
I hope so. That was my rant a few minutes ago. I hope we have truly learned something from this. But apparently, again, we keep doing this. We keep looking at it and going, think about Putin. It's our right as Mother Russia to take back our countrymen that at one point was part of our country. That's manifest destiny right there. It's the same thing.
Hey, don't let Vladimir Putin don't let him hear you say that. We might be confused for spreading Russian disinformation. But
I said that's what he said. I didn't say that's what I said.
But there is a cost every time you engage in one of these sorts of things. Are we better at counting that now?
I think we want to be. I'm not 100% convinced that we are literally, but I think that we want to be, and I do think we strive to be. I think we try. I think we try. I think we're at least on the path of trying to determine that the lesser of two evils is not the right decision-making process. We need to go the right way and the wrong way and figure out what the right way is. And it's not a matter of the lesser of two evils. It's a matter of, this is, we really should do it this way. And I think we're trying. I just don't think we're there yet. I don't think we've filtered through all the BS that people and human greed. I'll just go back to that, because I talked about that in the interpreter part a while back on this podcast. If we can eliminate the human greed of it, I think we'll be much further along than we are right now. I think, again, I think we're trying. I think there are people and organizations and things like that that try to point those things out now that we didn't have back in the day, right? Like we have the WHO, the UN. We have all these things now that we didn't have back in 1860 when this book is written about, not when it was written, but when it was written about. So I think there's a lot more people looking under the microscope now than there was before. So to your point, I do think we're getting there. I don't think we're there. I don't think we're quite there yet.
One last thought, and then I'll turn the corner on this. We'll turn the corner because I want to talk about the rise and fall of Donehogawa. He was an interesting cat. Talk about human greed and those other kinds of things. Little Crow's War. Little Crow's War was driven by the desire to not appear to be a coward. That's pride.
Yeah.
That's right up there with greed. And
Correct.
lust for power. Vanity. Vanity is pride's little brother. All those, right? They're all up there. And if y'all been tithing like good Catholics, you should know your 7 deadly sins.
The only one I don't agree with is gluttony. I want to eat whatever I want. I love to eat. You may not be able to tell by my stature, but trust me when I tell you, I love to eat. So anyway, sorry.
Anyway, yeah, okay. We all have our own personal failings. Those human drivers that drive manifest destiny, that drive making war, that drive violence, those are the costs that we probably should be getting better at counting, right?
Yes.
Okay. For my part, I don't believe we're going to be able to get rid of those. I think the tragedy of humanity is that when we do find life on planet X or wherever, and I personally believe we probably will, we'll find some bacteria somewhere that'll be something we ain't never seen before. And we won't be able to call it bacteria because it'll fit into some phylus or genome genus that we don't understand. And it'll be great. It'll open up all new kinds of things in our heads, and we'll have something new to argue about. I'm a big fan of this idea of I'm a big fan of the idea of going other places and other planets. I'm not a big fan of doing it because we have to occupy it because of climate change or Earth's eventually going to suck or whatever. Okay. Exploration is the act of exploring is always a rapacious and to a certain degree selfish act. It always is. I don't think there's any way to untaint that. I think there are ways to ameliorate it and lessen it, but I don't think there's ways to totally, completely rid us of all of that. So, with that being said, how do we do this without dehumanizing other people? Because fundamentally, at the end of the day, the bacteria on planet X is still it's a bacteria. Now, if we find human beings there, which I'm waiting for that. I'm waiting for the big home run. That's what I'm waiting on. I don't want the singles. I don't want the doubles. I want the home run. I want like little gray men showing up. Or just telling us, go away and leave us alone. Which that will actually be perfect if that happens. We've been watching your TV for the last 100 years. Go away and leave us alone.
Yeah.
How do we continue to see human beings as human or other entities or whatever? But let's keep it with human beings with what we know. How do we manage to see more of other people's humanity so that we're not engaging in that type of rapacious behavior? How do we do that? And by the way, that's one of the ideas in here. I think that's why D. Brown wrote this book, was to get to see human Indians as human beings.
So that's a great question. I think it's I think the fundamental thing that we lose is the ability to listen, right? Like I think that's really where it starts. Because if you're not, or at least the willingness to listen, because if you're not at least willing to listen to somebody else talk or express their likes, their dislikes, if you're not, you have got to be willing to listen. And I'm not talking about listening to listening to reply. I'm talking about listening to understand, right? So if you listen, if you listen to somebody, if you listen to an argument that is I like to talk about, like, so my significant other and I will get into conversations about, like, we're not arguing to disagree, we're arguing to understand, because we get into these conversations that turn into, that's not what I said, that's not what I meant. Okay, well, explain it to me. Instead of me just assuming, I want you to explain it to me so that I understand. I'm not looking for a rebuttal. I don't want, and we usually have these conversations, by the way, by prefacing it by saying, listen, I have an issue, a concern that I want to talk to you about. I don't need you to reply. I just need you to understand my point of view. And if you understand my point of view, we don't need any more discussion. I'm good. As long as you understand why it hurt me, or why it bothered me, or why it angered me, as long as you can look at me and say, okay, I understand, conversation can be over. I don't need a back and forth about it. I just need you to understand why this impacted me. And if you can say to me, yes, I understand that, I'm not mad at you anymore. I'm not upset. I'm good. We're good. Right. And I don't think that happens on any other scale than 1-to-1. I don't think that can happen on any other scale aside from 1-to-1. Because even when nations are representing, or leaders of nations are representing entire populations of nations, they cannot speak for 300 million people. They cannot speak for 150 million people. It doesn't work that way. You have to get them to, there's too much involved, right? Like, there's too much involved. So, but a one-on-one, individual people can listen to understand and not have a need to reply. So I think if we can continue to massage that path and make it better, I think we can. I don't know if it's possible. I have no idea. Like I said, when you're talking about a delegation, right? You have 3, 4, 5 people of Earthlings going to meet your 4 or 5 people of little gray men that are representing an entire planet of people. How can you listen to understand when you don't know what the people behind you are understanding?
Right.
Like, you have no insights to that, right? Like, there's no way. The only thing I could think of is, again, I'm very much so about preemptive, right? Being proactive about things. So again, if I were in charge of this delegation to go see the little gray men, my first course of action would not be to go talk to, my first course of action would be to talk to my own people. What do you want me to understand? What do you want me to get them to understand about our situation, about our stance, about our plan? I need to understand my own people before I can ever go to that. And I've never heard a leader of a country come back to the people and say, hey, I'm going to go meet so-and-so. I want some understanding of what we want to gain out of that. Like, how does that happen on a global scale or on a countrywide scale? Now, back in 1860, it probably would have been a little bit easier. There was only about 3 million people here. So
might have worked out better.
Might have worked out better.
Might have worked out better. Yeah, absolutely, for sure. Back to the book. Back to Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. We're going to turn the corner here. We're going to talk about what I personally think is probably one of the more interesting individuals in all of this book, Commissioner Parker, the commissioner of the Board of Indian Commissioners. And he was also known as Donehogawa of the Iroquois. And this is how he thought of himself. The commissioner was well aware of Red Cloud's dissatisfaction, of the Sioux leader's determination to keep the country he had won by treaty, and of his desire for trading for a trading post near that country. Although Spotted Tail had gone to Fort Randall on the Missouri River, the Brulés were already among the most rebellious of the reservation Indians. With their enormous followings among the Plains tribes, Red Cloud and Spotted Tail seemed to the commissioner to be the keys to peace. Could an Iroquois chief win the confidence of the Sioux chiefs? Donehogawa was not certain, but he decided to try. The commissioner sent a polite invitation to Spotted Tail, but he was too shrewd an Indian to use a direct message to solicit a visit from Red Cloud. Such an invitation most likely would have been received by Red Cloud as a summons to be proudly scorned. Through an intermediary, speaking of an interpreter, to Tom's point, Red Cloud was informed that he would be a welcome visitor to the Great Father's house in Washington if he wanted to come. The idea of such a journey intrigued Red Cloud. It would give him an opportunity to talk with the Great Father and tell him that the Sioux did not want a reservation on the Missouri. He could also see for himself if the little father of the Indians, the commissioner named Parker, was truly an Indian and could write like a white man. As soon as the commissioner heard that Red Cloud wanted to come to Washington, he sent Colonel John E. Smith out to Fort Laramie to act as escort. Red Cloud selected 15 Oglalas to accompany him, and on May 26th, the party boarded a special coach on the Union Pacific and started the long journey eastward. It was a great experience riding on their old enemy, the Iron Horse. Omaha, a city named for Indians, was a beehive of white people, and Chicago, another Indian name, was terrifying with its noise and confusion and buildings that seemed to reach the sky. The white men were as thick and numerous and aimless as grasshoppers, moving always in a hurry, but never seeming to get to whatever place it was they were going to. After 5 days of clatter and motion, the Iron Horse brought them into Washington. Except for Red Cloud, the members of the delegation were dazed and ill at ease. Commissioner Parker, who truly was an Indian, greeted them warmly. I am very glad to see you here today. I know that you have come a great distance to see the Great Father, the President of the United States. I'm glad that you have had no accident and that you have arrived here all safe. I want to hear what Red Cloud has to say for himself and his people. I have but a few words to say, Red Cloud responded. When I heard that my great father would permit me to come to see him, I was glad and came right off. Telegraph to my people and say that I am safe. That is all I have to say today. When Red Cloud and the Oglalas arrived at the Washington House on Pennsylvania Avenue, where a suite had been reserved for them, they were surprised to find Spotted Tail and a delegation of Brulés waiting for them there. Because Spotted Tail had obeyed the government and moved his people to the Missouri River Agency, Commissioner Parker feared there would be trouble between the two rival Tetons. They shook hands, however, and as soon as Spotted Tail told Red Cloud that he and his Brulés thoroughly hated the Dakota Reservation and wanted to return to their Nebraska hunting grounds east of Fort Laramie, the Oglala accepted the Brulé as a returned ally. Next day, Donehogawa of the Iroquois took his Sioux guests on a tour of the capital, visiting the Senate in session, the Navy Yard, and the Arsenal. For their journey, the Sioux had been outfitted with white man's clothing, and it was obvious that most of them were ill at ease in their tight-fitting black coats and buttoned shoes. When Donehogawa told them that Matthew Brady had invited them to his studio to have their photographs taken, Red Cloud said it did not suit him to do so. I am not a white man, but a Sioux, he explained, and I am not dressed for such an occasion. Donehogawa understood immediately and let his visitors know that if it so pleased them, they could dress in buckskins, blankets, and moccasins for dinner at the White House with President Grant. At the White House reception, the Sioux were more impressed by the hundreds of blazing candles and glittering chandeliers than they were by the Great Father and his cabinet members, the foreign diplomats and congressmen who came to stare at these wild men in the midst of Washington. Spotted Tail, who enjoyed good food, especially like the strawberries and ice cream. Surely the white men have many more good things to eat than they send to the Indians, he remarked. During the next few days, Donehogawa set about bargaining with Red Cloud and Spotted Tail. To obtain a permanent peace, he had to know exactly what they wanted so that he could balance this against the pressure of politicians representing white men who wanted the Indians' land. It was not an enviable position for a sympathetic Indian to be in. He arranged a meeting at the Interior Department, inviting representatives from all branches of the government to meet with the Sioux visitors. Secretary of the Interior Jacob Cox opened the proceedings with the sort of oration these Indians had heard many times before. The government would like to give the Indians arms and ammunition for hunting, Cox said, but could not do this until it was sure that all the Indians were at peace. Keep the peace, he concluded, and then we will do what is right for you. He said nothing about the Sioux reservation on the Missouri. Red Cloud responded by shaking hands with Secretary Cox and the other officials. Look at me, he said. I was raised on this land where the sun rises. Now I come from where the sun sets. Whose voice was first sounded on this land? The voice of the red people who had but bows and arrows. The great father says he is good and kind to us. I don't think so. I am good to his white people. From the word sent me, I come all the way to his house. My face is red, yours is white. The Great Spirit has made you to read and write, but not me. I have not learned. I come here to tell you, my great father, what I do not like in my country. You are all close to the great father and are a great many chiefs. The men in the great father sends to us have no sense, no heart. I do not want my reservation on the Missouri. This is the fourth time I have said so. He stopped for a moment and gestured towards Spotted Tail and the Brule delegation. Here are some of the people from there now. Their children are dying off like sheep. The country does not suit them. I was born at the forks of the Platte, and I was told that the land belonged to me from north, south, east, and west. When you send goods to me, they are stolen all along the road. So when they reached me, they were only a handful. They held a paper for me to sign, and that is all I got for my land. I know the people you send out there are liars. Look at me. I am poor and naked. I do not want war with my government. I want you to tell all this to my great father. Donehogawa of the Iroquois, the commissioner replied. We will tell the president what Red Cloud has said today. The president told me he would talk with Red Cloud very soon. Red Cloud looked at the red man who had learned to read and write and who was now the little father of the Indians. You might grant my people the powder we ask, he said. We are but a handful, and you are a great and powerful nation. You make all the ammunition. All I ask is enough for my people to kill game. The Great Spirit has made all things that I have in my country wild. I have to hunt them up. It is not like you, who go out and find what you want. I have eyes. I see all you whites, which you are doing, raising stock and so forth. I know I will have to come to that in a few years myself. It is good. I have no more to say. The other Indians, Oglalas and Brules, crowded around the commissioner, all wishing to speak with him. The red man, who had become their little father. What kind of people will we be? Fundamentally, this is the question that lies underneath the United States of America. From the founding of our country, all of the way to now, the most bruising battles, and we're even having one right now around illegal immigration, is what kind of Americans are we going to be? Are we going to be Polish and Irish? Are we going to be Italian and Eastern European? Are we going to be Mexican? Are we going to be Black? Or are we going to be Indian? What kind of Americans are we going to be exactly? Who is right? To Tom's point earlier, who speaks for us? And what does us actually mean? And fundamentally, at the end of the day, can a nation where we have people of varying backgrounds and tribes, can they all be bound together by an ethic rather than by other more material things? We've talked about the dehumanizing of the Native Americans. And by the way, the chapter on Commissioner Parker or Donehogawa ends with him quitting the Bureau of Indian Affairs and going off to become rich because, well, quite frankly, at the end of the day, if you can't beat them, join them, right?
Assimilate or die.
Well, let's talk about that. What kind of Americans will we be? I don't think there's any way around this. We went from this idea of a melting pot to a mixing bowl to, I don't even think people talk about, at least I haven't heard anybody under the age of like 20 ever talk about this country being a collection of people that are just trying to get along. I think that that's just like Manifest Destiny. That's another thing that's gone out of the zeitgeist. Now we talk a lot about all of our differences, quite a bit. And I don't know that that's better. Matter of fact, I'm almost sure that that's worse. But I don't know how to cross. No, I won't say I don't know how to cross. I think multiple generations of people who have come before me in this country attempted to cross that ravine. And just because it was too hard, we abandoned it. And I think we abandoned it partially because of historical guilt, partially because doing a melting pot is really hard, partially because there's been so many sins, from the sin of slavery to the sin of how we treated the Indians. There's been so many sins and so much guilt on those sins. And we haven't had a leader come by that has showed us the way across that chasm. And so I don't. That's the question. What kind of Americans will we be? Because we're in a negotiation with each other fundamentally. And we have to see each other's humanity, yes, but we've got to all collectively get to the future together. Otherwise it's not. It's ugly in North America. Let's just say that.
I think there's a foundational thing that we're missing here, right? Like, so I agree with you. I'm a little older than you are, but not by enough to make it different, right? So when I talk about like when we were kids, right? So I can say when we were kids because we're close enough. But I remember like so you're right that this paradigm shift of when we were kids, we didn't talk about it, right? We didn't. I grew up in a neighborhood that was very dominated, a very dominant Hispanic and Black neighborhood. I was probably the minority in the neighborhood. But I didn't care. They didn't care. Like we just didn't talk about it, right? We didn't talk about our differences. We were trying so hard just to be neighborhood kids. That's all that mattered to us, right? Being neighborhood kids. And then when we bring our parents into this, they did the same thing. It was weird, right, to us at the time, where like my parents were white, they were Black, they were Hispanic, but yet nobody ever talked about the fact that they were different than us. Like nobody ever mentioned it. Like it was just like, right. And now we're like, we have to mention it. Like we have to show our individuality. We have to show when we talk about our community, we're not talking about the neighborhood we grew up in. We're talking about our race. Like when you talk about I'm going to say something that Hasan knows I don't mean, so just bear with me here. But when you talk about your community, you're talking about the Black community. Mm-hmm. That's not necessarily the case. Like you could be talking about your cul-de-sac. But we assume that when you say my community, because you look different than I do, that you're talking about the Black community. When I do it, I'm talking about the Native community. And I think one of the things that I think that's okay if we're talking about those differences in celebration of uniqueness and not in the better or worse of society. I think that's part of what we lose. Like, I think that's part of the part that was missing. Like when we were kids, we didn't talk about it because we wanted to be one thing. Like we wanted to elevate our universal likenesses beyond our differences. And today we want to elevate our differences beyond our universal likenesses, right? And again, it's not better or worse. It's just that if we're going to elevate the differences, they should be individual differences, not racial differences. Not like I want to talk about how I'm special, not the fact, I'm not special because I'm Native. I'm special because I am who I am. That's okay. But to start talking and elevating the Native part of me beyond anybody else, we're going to head down another dark path.
Yeah.
We're going to head down another dark part of history that we don't see coming, that we're not seeing this coming. But I think it's, again, to your point, like what we were talking about a little while ago about the delegation of the little gray men. If we're talking about the human race and humanity and humankind, we are okay, versus if all of the delegation is representing one or two or three races of our planet, and they're trying to communicate with the little gray men from those three perspectives instead of the worldwide perspective. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think the melting pot, I think it's still there. I think it's still there, and I think it still could potentially work. But I think we have to start looking beyond our community needs to be our whole community, not the individual races of. We got to stop talking about races having their own communities and start talking about the human part of community. And like, and again, like I said, I remember when I was a kid, whenever, I mean, we would protect each other if we were in somebody else's neighborhood. Like, I didn't care. It was like, it didn't matter. Our color didn't matter. It mattered in other ways. I agree. Our differences matter. I'm not suggesting our differences don't matter. Our differences matter, but it's more about making sure that the differences don't differentiate us from being human. Like it's
right. Yeah.
so
Well,
and by the way, I'm not sure how much leadership we talked about on this podcast, but
yeah, we
that's
probably
okay.
didn't. Yeah, it's okay. Well, okay. Then hell, we'll turn the corner. We got 3 minutes anyway. So let's put this in a lens of leadership. If you made it all the way to the end. No, what can leaders learn from D. Brown's work? From Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. What can they learn from studying the bald and raw history of of settling the of moving into exploring I don't even know, I don't want to use the word enculturating. Let's use the word exploring the American West. What can leaders take from this?
I do think I was kidding, by the way, that we hadn't talked about anything to do with leadership, because I think we did. I think we actually did cover quite a few things. But to summarize, I think we talked quite a bit about, learning from your mistakes, listening to understand versus listening to reply. I think all of that I think that's very valuable from a leadership perspective, because you don't always have to have the answers. But if you're willing to listen to your people, sometimes that's half the battle. They want to just be listened to and understood. And if you can do that, they'll follow you. They'll even if you don't have the answer right away, they'll follow you because they're expecting that when you see the answer, you're going to know what it is, because you understand and you listen to understand, and you don't listen to reply. I think the other part of it too is not leaving things to interpretation. I think we talked about that a little bit. Making sure that the definitions and the understandings are deep and not surface level. That you don't just pass somebody over that may not understand what you're. My image pops into my mind as a training session, right? You have 30 people sitting in a training session, a trainer sitting up top, and they're just blurting out information to people and dictating it, and they move on. And you have no idea if those people in that room actually understood what the hell you were just talking about.
Yep.
So not just listening to understand, but explaining to be understandable, making sure that people are ready before you move to the next step. Don't just push along and push forward to just out of brute force. Make sure that you're taking a systematic approach to what you're doing and understanding. I think all of that is in there. I think all of that is, and I think we talked about all of that. So I do think I was kidding when I said we didn't talk about leadership at all. I do think we did talk about a lot of it. So I think there's a lot of lessons that D. Brown, and again, not necessarily D. Brown himself, because these are not his opinions. These are facts that he finds, things that he pulled out of historical documents, things he pulled out of historical interviews. That these are all factual pieces of information. So it's not his writing that we're learning these from. It's our own history. It's our own U.S. history that we're learning this from. And if we can really push forward in the sense of not allowing us to repeat it, and let's not repeat history, I think we're gonna be okay. I think that's a good lesson to learn.
I have nothing to add to that at all. I would encourage everyone to pick up the book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. I'm going to have links to a couple of other supporting documents and some supporting reading that I did for this podcast in the show notes below the player that I think will be very, very helpful. And again, this opens the door to our month of looking at what are the lessons that leaders can learn from, quite frankly, as Tom put it, the facts of history. Okay. From T.E. Lawrence all the way to even Leo Tolstoy. The facts of history can teach us quite a bit as leaders about what to do. Well, all the way here at the end of history, right? In the West. And with that, Tom and I are out.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening and subscribing to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. If you're listening to this on any of the major podcast players, like iTunes, Google Podcasts, or Spotify, please go ahead and leave us a 5-star review and write a little bit in there. A couple of sentences is good enough. That actually helps us game those algorithms that I was just maybe addressing. And, of course, it helps us grow the show. Tell all your family, tell all your friends, and tell the leaders in your life that you know that need to be listening to this show that this show exists. By the way, if you want to get started on the leadership path yourself, or you know some people who need to go on the leadership path, HSCT Publishing, the home company of Leadership Toolbox and Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, can help you and your team do that. So check out our training webinars, coaching services, and more at leadershiptoolbox.us. We are remote, we're live, we're in person, we're on video, and we've got leadership development solutions for your civic group, nonprofit staff, public sector staff, or even your private sector leaders. And of course, you're going to want to check out our video-based subscription service at leadingkeys.com. That's leadingkeys.com for leadership development on demand. You don't like videos, you don't like training, but you really like the podcast? Well, I would also recommend reading a book. Matter of fact, I'd recommend reading my most recent book, 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. You can get that in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Ingram Spark, and any other place that you order books online. Finally, of course, we're on YouTube just like everybody else is. We'd love to have you help us grow the YouTube channel, so like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the HSCT Publishing channel on YouTube. Just search for HSCT Publishing, or you can search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button. Subscribing helps us grow the show, as it does with the audio, just is the same with the video. All right, that's it for me.